Welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and we're very happy to have all of you here. And please say hello to our guest this evening, Steve Butterman. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Nice to see you. Where are we finding you this evening?
I am in my messy office at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, just down the street from you, sort of.
Great. And you teach at the University of Miami, yes?
I do.
Yes. And tell us what you teach there.
I teach, my primary appointment is in modern languages and literatures, where I teach Portuguese and Luso-Afro-Brazilian cultural studies. And I also work in queer studies in the LGBTQ Studies program.
I want to get back to that in a minute, but just want to continue with all of my welcomes here. First of all, I'd like to do a shout out to my colleague, Paula Sierra. Paula, who's there in the background, just making sure this is all working seamlessly. Hello, Paula, nice to see you. Paula, what episode is this for you? Have you done 20 of these shows yet?
I don't have count, but somewhere in there.
Well, thank you for all the help that you do in trying to make all of these possible. Tonight's talk, like all of the talks in this series, are sponsored by our fund, which is an LGBTQ community foundation located here in South Florida. And so we want to do a shout out to them and thank them for the work. If you are not able, or if you have friends who are not able to join us for this talk, they're all archived on our website at stonewall-museum.org. We have been doing them. We started doing them almost years ago during the pandemic. I think we started it in May, and I think we're up to about 60 or 70 episodes of different writers, artists, thinkers, critics, activists on different queer topics. And so it's been a wonderful way to engage different people with the Stonewall Archive and also to bring our message to a wider audience. All of those shows are available online through our website, as I said, so please feel free to visit that. Also, you can sign up to get our weekly newsletter. You might notice that I have a little pin on that says "Say Gay," as does Stephen as well too. And so we're at a very precarious moment here in South Florida because the state legislature, both the House and the Senate, have passed a bill which discourages classroom teachers and individuals in classrooms from discussing sexual orientation or gender identity. And one could even say that it will be prohibited from being discussed in those classrooms. The governor of the state has said that he will sign it. And so indeed, in 2022, we are in the middle of another culture war. Some of us are old enough to remember the Jesse Helms days and D'Amato and all of those things, but clearly people want to put individual rights in the middle of a political battle, and that's exactly where we are right now. If you go to our website, you'll see Stonewall strong opposition to this particular legislation, and that's why we have buttons on that say gay, because the attitude and the attempt by legislators in the state is to, or at least a majority of them, is to prohibit the discussion of one's sexual orientation. The point was just brought up about the Briggs Initiative, which of course, Florida has a long history of this. You can go back to the Johns Committee in the late 1950s and early 60s, the Briggs Commission, we can go to Anita Bryant. And so it's a cycle that keeps happening. And unfortunately, children are often made the pawns of all this stuff. In this case, parents and politicians are saying, well, my children shouldn't be exposed to these things. And I don't know who's injured when someone is exposed to facts or history, because they're only facts and they're only history. And LGBTQ culture and history is American culture and history, and that's what we preserve. It's a major part of who we are as a people today. And gay people ain't going away anytime soon. You know, there are new ones born every day, thankfully. And so so this fight will go on. So that's what the say gay buttons are about. For those of you who are in South Florida, we hope you come by and visit us. We're located at 1300 East Sunrise Boulevard in Fort Lauderdale. And in the library, we have over 28,000. Actually, the truth is we're now up to 31,000 volumes in the library. We're truly running out of space. They're all arranged under the Library of Congress system, fiction, nonfiction, biography. And so please come by and take a look at those. And then also we have a archive. In our archive, we have 2,700 linear feet. It totals about 6 million pages of LGBTQ history going back to about 1950 to the present day. So complete runs of serials from The Advocate to the Bay Area Reporter to Philadelphia Gay News to, of course, everything here in South Florida. And I will put a plug out there that on April 21st, we'll be opening an exhibition at Nova Northeastern University or Nova, yes, at Nova University here in South Florida, which is called Queer History. And it's looking at LGBTQ history through various publications in our archive. There are about 125 objects are going to be in that show. We had a bunch of the volunteers working on it today and pulling things for it. And so we're very excited about that. So that exhibition will be opening on April 21st at Nova at the Alvin Sherman Library there. In addition, we have two exhibitions at Stonewall up right now. One is called Misinformation, which is looking at the similarities between the misinformation in the early days of HIV and AIDS and comparing it to the misinformation which has been spread about COVID-19. And that exhibition has been up for a few months, and soon that will come down. It will be replaced by a show which has been curated by Paula Sierra, who's here with us, called Early Gay Gatherings, looking at the 1950s and 1960s and some of those early meetings and groups of the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Review, which really led or built some of the foundational infrastructure for some of the LGBTQ movement and how they shared ideas through those meetings and conferences that they had. And then also right now we have an exhibition of work by Robert Giard, passed away in 2002, and he was a wonderful photographer who documented many LGBTQ writers in the late 1980s and into the 90s, and we've borrowed 10 beautiful silver gelatin prints from his estate. They're absolutely great. Sarah Schulman is one of the young Sarah Schulman is one of them, and Jackie Woodson is one of them as well. And so Sylvia Rivera is in that exhibition, and so please stop by and see those. When that exhibition comes down, we have queued up another show about LGBTQ writers called Outright, which is, there was a conference about LGBTQ authors that was held in San Francisco and in Boston in the 1990s for 8 or 9 years. And so we have excerpts from the speeches that were made by many LGBTQ writers at those various conferences, and then talking about some of the writers who are writing in those particular styles today. And so that exhibition, we're now mid-March, that will probably go up in early April. So there's obviously a lot going on. We have many other presenters who will be coming through this series, and so there's a lot going on there. So, and again, just a final shout out to our fund. Of course, we appreciate all the work that you do in trying to make all this stuff happen. For those of you who are here with us live, we just ask if you have questions, just throw them into the chat or the Q&A. We will get to them. We promise to answer everyone's question as soon as we can. And I also want to do a shout out to our friends on Facebook. Thank you for joining us there. It's a way in which a lot of people get to see this and to see the work that we've done. So I think I finished all of my notes. So Stephen, we're back to you. And so as you say, we're finding you in your office at the University of Miami. And how long have you been at the University of Miami?
I arrived here in 2000, so I'm actually just over 20 years here.
Wow. What brought you there?
Well, other than the job itself and the job market, of course, my grandmother used to live just outside of Fort Lauderdale and Plantation.
Yep.
And that was sort of the personal incentive was she was so inspirational my entire life, and my best friend actually. And so I got to spend the last 12 years of her life being a lot closer to her and taking her out for Chinese food and bringing her groceries. And she lived almost 100 years, 99 years and 11 months. So
where did you grow up, Stephen?
I grew up originally in Montreal for the first 9 years of my life, and then my family moved to Denver,
Oh, great.
Colorado.
How was Denver? Did you enjoy that?
I did. I thought it was a beautiful place to be. Mountains are gorgeous. People are friendly. I got a great education while I was there too. So I went to school in Boulder, and I try to go back and visit as often as I can. It's such a special place.
I had an opportunity to live just outside of Aspen in the Roaring Fork Valley in Basalt for probably about 4 or 5 years, and I never skied. And so the winters, as beautiful as they were kind of wasted on me while I was there. So I did discover one thing, which is that I definitely like the man-made environment more than I like. As much as I appreciate the natural environment, I miss the man-made environment. And being in Denver, of course, or being in the mountains, you have to love the natural environment to be there. So
yes, lots of great outdoor activities.
Yeah.
I miss the hiking.
Yeah, the hiking.
Florida is a beautiful place too, but it's so flat in this region. You know, there's not very many places to go hiking. But you know, we do have the beaches.
Yes, absolutely right. So the book we're going to talk about tonight is Queering and the Querying of the Paradise of Paradox. And this book came out last year, the end of it last year?
In the middle of the summer, in June 2021, yes.
So let's start with the title, Paradise of Paradox. What does that mean?
Well, there's a saying in Brazil that I hold to be true to this day, and it's probably one of the things that keeps me connected and fascinated by studying Brazilian culture, and that is, "O Brasil não é para principiantes," which means in translation, Brazil is not for beginners. And one of the things that has always attracted me to Brazilian culture and the Portuguese language is both its malleability and its flexibility, and also its ambiguity. My initial interest in Portuguese, and particularly Brazilian Portuguese, was to musical talents that are very androgynous in nature, and the sort of fascinating social inversions around sexuality, and also around gender identity. It's a simultaneous fascination with and repulsion of that part of the book is trying to grapple with, to get my head around. And so there are many paradoxes, but the reason I use Paradise of Paradox, other than the fact that I'm a closeted poet and who's supposed to write in academic language, is that for me, in the 20 plus years that I've been studying about Brazil, every time you seem to kind of wrap your head around something, something else comes up. There's always sort of this contradictory space. So I use paradox in the sense of contradiction, but not in the sense of reconciliation of contradiction, in the sense of suspension, of maintaining contradiction, because I think that's where we can learn the most. Right? That's where we can really get some rich perspectives by not having to resolve or finalize a conclusion, but rather suspend various perspectives.
And of course, the paradise piece, I assume, is the idea about a sense of place. As we think about paradise, we think about a particular location. So as one not having ever been to Brazil, I take it that it is a place that you find about the land and the people and the spirit and everything there to be very desirable.
Yes, and I will also say this is a shout out to one of my own personal LGBTQ icons, and that is Brazilian writer and activist João Silvério Trevisan, who we recently invited to UM as part of a conference. And João Silvério Trevisan's first book, among many very important activist interventions, is called Divassos no Paraíso, which means perverts in paradise. And it was translated by the Gay Sunshine Press way back in the day, as Perverts in Paradise. And so I kind of use his work as a springboard and also as an homage, as a tribute to the kind of work that he has devoted his life to in Brazil.
So in preparation for our chat, I started doing a little bit of research about Brazil, simply because, as I said, I've never been and hadn't thought that much about it recently. And I discovered it's probably the 6th largest nation on the planet. Population, I think, of well over 200 million people, which would probably put, from a population standpoint, place it about 2/3 of the size of the United States, which is really it's an amazing. We're 340 maybe, and maybe Brazil is 210. So we're talking about a huge population. Would you consider it to be a democratic government now?
That's a really tough question. Technically, yes, Brazil is living a democracy in writing and in theory, much like democratic institutions have been under attack in this country, in the US. Brazil is also following a similar path with significant increase in authoritarianism and even fascism in relation to intolerance and disrespect for differences of various kinds.
Yeah.
So yes, technically, but in spirit, the erosion of democracy in Brazil has been significant in recent years.
And also a country which I think is probably heavily influenced by Catholicism or Christianity as well too, right?
Correct. Although more and more, there's less of a Catholic presence and more of a Protestant and evangelical presence, even within the government and political systems. So Brazil has made a rapid shift. It's still, of course, within Christianity, but from Catholicism to very radicalized for many Protestantism.
Right. And today's Brazil, regardless of the particular flavor of government, but today's Brazil is a result of the colonialism that happened in the 16th century. It was in the 1500s. I don't know very much about the indigenous people who were there before the Portuguese came, but clearly over the last 500 or 600 years, the influence of the Portuguese has been profound. I mean, Portuguese is their actual language now, and on day-to-day life is part of their culture as well, right?
Absolutely. Portuguese is the only official language recognized by the government in Brazil, to the detriment of many indigenous languages that are spoken within its borders.
Yeah. And then so against this backdrop, and so the economy, we know Venezuela has oil. Would I be correct in thinking that Brazil has a strong agrarian economy? Am I right in thinking that it is coffee and other crops that are harvested there?
Yes, you are correct. And the plantation society that came along with institutions like slavery for the export of these products.
But then against all of that backdrop, we have a present day country in 2022 that has actually been more aggressive than about giving LGBTQ individuals rights than even what we would consider a Western democracy like the United States. I mean, is it true that people in Brazil have had gay people in Brazil have had the right to marry for quite some time?
Actually, yes and no. The federal marriage law passed in Brazil 1 year before the US. One of the paradoxes and sort of the juxtapositions that I study as far as social justice issues in Brazil is the fact that the way that Brazil markets itself, the imaginary of Brazil, particularly abroad, does not necessarily and often does not politically in daily life reflect the realities that trans and LGBTQ people and communities experience in everyday life. So Brazil is, there's a lot of packaging about Brazil for foreigners that kind of hides and disguises the insidious homotransphobia that occurs on a daily basis. Brazil is one of the big paradoxes as well. It's the largest in São Paulo. São Paulo hosts the largest LGBT pride parade in the world. And at the same time, Brazil has the largest number of assassinations of LGBT people by far. The second, statistically, Mexico is next on the list, and then the United States. But there's quite a distance, and this is in proportion to population, of course, and demography. But it's something that is quite striking. One of the paradoxes that touches on visibility and invisibility as strategies for survival, and the instinct sort of coming out to what are the repercussions or the consequences as far as backlash to these mega manifestations of pride parades that can have as many as 3.5 or 4 million people in one space, if you can imagine what that would look like.
Yeah, and of course, that's something that you touch on, and as we start sort of digging into the book, I think the first couple of chapters you really focus on the Gay Pride Parade, and I'm taken by a few of the things, and you just mentioned one in the sense that it's the largest pride event, and I'm carefully using the word event because I'm going to ask a question about that in a minute, but it started back in 1997, I think. So as you think about pride events out there, of course, the first one was the Christopher Street Day celebration in 1970 after what happened at the Stonewall Inn. So the first one was in 1970, and then by 1975, of course, we had them in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago. The first one here in South Florida was in 1977. And so it took a while for them to get going. But it took a while for this Pride event to happen. It didn't happen until 1997. What took so long in Brazil?
Well, actually, there were Pride festivals and festivities prior to 1997 that were more local, and in Rio de Janeiro and in Rio, there were also prides that occurred prior to 1997, but no, not significantly earlier than that. Oftentimes when in a global model of global South, global North model, Brazil is very heavily influenced by North American imperialism, by cultural realities that are present in North America and also parts of Europe, particularly France and Italy, much less so Portugal, interestingly, as being sort of the former colony of Portugal. And there is this there are many adages around the fact that things come to Brazil in a delayed manner, that there's like this this period of pause time for events of a global nature, but that I'm using quotes because it's almost always with a glance to the north, right? The glance to, not to neighbors in the global south, right? But to neighbors up north and in northwestern, mostly Europe, that influence, and I would say to the detriment of local domestic culture. There's a phenomenon that I talk about somewhat in the book, but that presents itself often in my classes, and that is what one of my favorite and most important writers, Lima Barreto, wrote about, and that is Yankeeismo brasileiro. So what that means is Brazilian Yankeeism. And so in the 1920s, and when he was writing at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, Lima Barreto posited that Brazilians, by and large, have almost genetically, even not just culturally, inherited an inferiority complex in which products that are locally made, I mean, even something as amazing as Guaraná, right? The Brazilian national beverage, or caipirinha, are seen as somehow inferior to or not with the same kind of prestige as the products, the counterparts that are abroad. This also pertains to musicians, it pertains to writers, it pertains to activists, it pertains to, the list goes on. So that there's even Carmen Miranda became much more famous outside of Brazil when she was in Hollywood and was rejected and dejected when she returned to Brazil to perform there. So that's just sort of one example of so many others that shows this tendency of overvaluing what comes from abroad and undervaluing what comes from within its own borders, as rich as those products and people and creativity may be.
So sticking with the idea about the pride demonstrations, and as you say in the book, started 1997, but as you say,
In São Paulo, yes.
Yeah, in São Paulo, but started other places as well. One thing I was struck by, and I don't know whether or not this was intentional or precise on your part, but many people who organize pride events in the United States, they sort of bristle at the idea of calling them parades. They still want to call them marches. And you embraced, and it seems as if people in Brazil embraced the idea of it being a parade. And also what I found to be very interesting in reading the book was that it's not just for gay people. There are many people that it becomes a celebration that everybody gets engaged in. And so as we think of, and of course, if we think about gay pride events in New York or Los Angeles today, I mean, pre-COVID or post-COVID, whatever they are, there are many non-gay people who are just celebrating on the streets as well too. But do you sense a different point of view between the São Paulo pride events and those that you see here in the United States?
Yes, and then you're hitting on a sort of the central nervous system of those two chapters, in the sense, in a couple of different ways. One of those ways is that, and this is another of many paradoxes in the book. So yes, the majority generally of attendees or spectators, participants in the Pride Parade in São Paulo self-identify as heterosexual. And sometimes it is the clear majority, sometimes it's around 50%, et cetera, and depending on the statistics that you look at. At the same time, we also need to keep in mind that there's it's a big party, and that's one of the other central concerns of the Pride Parade organizing committee that we're experiencing right now in Boston, for example, in this country, where wanting to bring the militant activist march back the demonstration, which is what it was meant to be and what it started as opposed to this feverish party, you know, this kind of this carnaval, like fora da estas, you know, outside carnival in the winter, which has been nicknamed, of course. And part of what I grapple with in this book is theorizing public manifestations, democratic public manifestations, as very complex, in the sense that the party or ludic or festive, if you will, celebratory aspect is just as important, I think, in a Brazilian consciousness, a collective consciousness, as is the advocacy and the political manifestation. There's a way in which the spirit of both coalesces in Brazilian Pride Parade, and particularly in São Paulo, and also this rather disturbing paradox that many folks that go to the Pride Parade may or may not be in support of LGBTQ rights. There's a spectacularization that also takes place of this sort of the othering, the fascination of drag queens or travestis, or people who manifest their exoticness differently, even though they're just being themselves, right? Or they're performing who they are. So I think it's also very important for us to distinguish, and this is what this goes back to sort of the marketing of Brazil or the packaging of Brazil, that many of those spectators are not necessarily what we used to call in Portuguese simpatizantes, which are gay friendly, sympathizers, right, of the LGBT community, and are there for a big party, right, and are there for a display, almost like a circus kind of display, and that also serves the objective, of course, of objectifying and othering the LGBT community that participates in the parade. So
yeah, it's something that I think that it's something that I think that you really put your finger on in the book here, and also the idea of cultural appropriation as well too, in the sense that people may be there participating because they're there for the party, but also, as you say, to objectify them and to see, I don't know, this is harsh, but you know, to see the freaks, or to see the non-heteronormative folks out there in the street, and they know it's a good party. It's kind of hard to imagine an event in the United States which has sort of gotten like that big, with 4 million people showing up to it, that you know, maybe, you know, a B'nai B'rith showing up and taking over St. Patrick's Day parade, you know, and I don't know, that's off the top of my head, but it's sort of the idea that that rather than the celebration of a particular culture and particular rights, that other people are there to well, I don't think there's a better word than appropriation. They're there to appropriate, and so it's interesting. And so, is that conflict there today in São Paulo among the LGBTQ activist communities who are planning these events and then looking around and seeing who's showing up?
Yes, and I go through in the book a kind of a meticulous reading of how media portrays various mainstream media. And I say mainstream because I'm interested in looking at how conventional, heteronormative, cis heteronormative Brazilian societies portray and convey and represent the Pride Parade. And what we find is that there's sort of a cyclical nature, so that in some years, in the period of 1997 to last year, you have this very strong opposition to corporate sponsorship. And then in other years, there's notably in 1990, in the first years, and in 2005 as well, sort of it's very cyclical. And I look at the reasons for that as well. There's this notion that nightclubs and bars and any kind of sort of, activity of nightlife was banned from the Pride Parade, specifically for the reasons that we've been discussing, that, we don't want to, from the perspective of the organizers of the Pride Parade, we don't want this event to manifest itself as just another excuse for a big carnaval or a big party. And we want to maintain the fighting spirit, conquering the fighting for civil rights, that bars and nightclubs also hold a stigma, for and from within the gay community of also in Brazil and elsewhere, of being portrayed as the only spaces, safe or otherwise, and here I'm thinking of Pulse, for example, where LGBT people can gather. And so there are many reasons that those oppositions were held. And ultimately, fortunately and unfortunately, the corporate interests usually prevail in most years, making the São Paulo Pride Parade the most lucrative phenomenon, actually, socioeconomically all year. And there are some amazing mega events like the São Paulo Fashion Week, which is internationally renowned, that only gets like a fraction of the money coming in from people visiting locally, domestically, and also internationally that partake in these events. So the financial reasons for having the Pride Parade cannot be overlooked.
And I think that's really important. Of course, those of us who've been involved in other Pride marches or activities in the United States, I'll take New York as an example. 3 years ago, pre-COVID, it was actually the first year that there was a really substantial effort to have a alternative Pride march in New York, because so many people who were concerned about activism were really repulsed by Bank of America and Citicorp and all the other corporations who had taken over sort of the mainstream America Pride Parade. And it's the homogenization, it's the flattening of that stuff, it's the normalizing, where people are there to voice their opinion about and their opposition to a particular course of action that their government takes or that their society takes. And then that's been taken over by corporate America. And so we, of course, and we'll see how Pride goes, in these next few years, post Black Lives Matter and post COVID, when we can start doing it. We've learned a lot in this stuff, but it's fascinating to hear how that's happened there.
I think it also, Hunter, it also touches on, we talk a lot in queer allyship about performative allyship or performative activism, which is a way to signal support, but not a meaningful way, and often with ulterior motives. So whether it's a corporation that is that's profiting from the support, or whether it is an ally, in quotes, wanting to support equal rights for all, it's often a performative gesture. And I think that also holds true for the corporatization of Pride parades that signal their support for the community, but then as soon as the Pride parade is over, the rainbow flags come down, the normativity, whether it's hetero or homonormativity, returns. And it becomes almost like a carnaval in that sense. You have the suspended time of 3 days or 5 days, whatever the case, before Lent, and then things are social realities that have been inverted or temporarily suspended or temporarily permitted are no longer allowed, sanctioned socially.
Yeah, and I think for those who are listening who are not necessarily aware of this dichotomy and the tension around these things, are just as you say, that with some of the corporations, they're simply investing in it and putting floats. I can only speak about the United States, but they're putting things out there simply to get eyeballs on logos. They understand there's a big audience. They understand let's go to New York. They understand there are 2 million people there. They want to get eyeballs on the logo to be able to put it there. And then the other advantage that they see is that they know, regardless of their political belief, they know that they have some portion of their workforce which identifies as LGBTQ. And so they want to appease them to some degree. And so they check that box in those places. But exactly to your point, are these the people who will be closing their Starbucks in Russia? Are these the people who will be actually making real corporate decisions around fundamental policy issues here? And I'm not conflating Russia with LGBTQ, but what I'm talking about is the idea that, you know, right now we're in a period in which we're seeing corporations. We don't fully know all the details yet, but we are seeing corporations taking a political stand. And it'll be curious to see, you know, once everything shakes down between Russia and Ukraine, and we have seen the corporate community do something, how activists will be speaking to them post-Ukraine war. You know, what will be the expectation on the corporate community for activists who are looking for some real change, or at least some stake, some statement. It's a bit of a paradox. I want to go back to a bit of Brazilian history to the extent that you might know it, and then I know you've got some slides and things that you have to present. But as I think about American cities and American culture, we had, of course, in the 19th century, there were obviously a great rural economy here, and then, you know, people who engaged in same-sex actions, they did what they did, and that was basically it. And there wasn't a community of sorts. And then the early part of the 20th century, as people moved into the urban areas, we have seen through great histories that are written about Miami and New York that there were, although it was illegal in many cases to have or participate in same-sex acts, and even in some cases it was illegal even for homosexuals to congregate in the same space. Mm-hmm. How do you know how Brazilian culture dealt with LGBTQ folks in the early part of the 20th century? Was there a community that developed around the major cities in the same way that it happened here in the United States? Were there some protections or people looking the other way? And then also, was there a period in which, like in the mid 20th century, where they were quashed down the way we did during the Eisenhower years? I mean, how were gay people treated in Brazil in the 20th century?
Those are great questions and very complex ones, which are my favorite. So Brazil also followed a similar path of, you know, during industrialization and modernization of the, and still arguably there is a significant movement from the rural to urban spaces. And in the case of Brazil, it is often the nordestino, the northeastern Brazilian retirante, who's the immigrant, a domestic immigrant that moves south and southeast or south to São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro or Porto Alegre in deep south Brazil in search of a better quality life. So one of the things, so yes, I think by transitioning to urban spaces, also similarly to the US, gave activists and thinkers and scholars and more opportunities to meet, to form groups, to create revistas or literary magazines, or what we call the fanzines, or the nanicas in Portuguese, that put together created a sense of community. There are a lot of parallels. One of the dangers, I think, though, is when we look at, and I won't make the claim that this is unique to Brazil, but in a Brazilian context specifically, there is significant violence to the point of assassination in the big urban spaces of, like, São Paulo, for example, like Rio de Janeiro, of Brazil. And there's this tendency to, I think, perhaps take too much stock in rural areas being associated with different mentality or different consciousness or less education or less access, that can really color our vision and of the violences that are occurring daily within the big cities. So these kinds of shifts that took place similarly to the US during Brazilian industrialization, and that manifested themselves in the, the 1900s as well. Often we have to be really careful about making sure that we're not hearing the narrative yet again, although this is common, that you have the oppressed, whether it's internalized or oppressed from somebody else, young LGBT person who is moving to the city for a better life, in the sense of being accepted or being oneself and not being persecuted by being authentically who they are. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because the migration patterns from rural to urban spaces do not necessarily follow, in general, but certainly in a Brazilian context, these narratives that we often, the discourses that we create and would, in many cases, want to believe that city life is better in the sense of progressive thinking. Though that is often the case, such as migrations to San Francisco in this country, or New York City, or other spaces where it is, where there's more of a sense of community, and a more progressive political background, socio-political background. I think it's a mistake to generalize too much about what happens in the streets, in the cities. And I mean specifically here, travestis, who are Brazilian transgender people who do not identify necessarily as transgender in the same ways that we use those categories in this country. A travesti, who is the most persecuted citizen in Brazil to this day, is generally a person who is born anatomically male, transitions to female, but does not necessarily, and in the case of travestis, does not have the penis removed, does not, in other words, the bottom surgery does not take place. And part of the reason for that is this positioning oneself in, and this could be perceived as romantic or exotic, but I don't mean it in that way, as part of like a third gender, in the sense that you're both male and female and post-male and post-female, so that of maintaining your anatomical, biological, sexual anatomy, while presenting oneself in the opposite gender, and Brazilian.
Yeah, and you say that in the sense of today, and of course, the group of individuals you're talking about are a group that are the most persecuted in Brazil today, in São Paulo, I think today.
I think all over the country, yes. Yeah.
But so what is the environment that allows their foes to persecute them, that allows them to be killed. It's not because these individuals are robbing their house or stealing their car or going on. It's not as if there's a provocation other than their mere existence. What is it within in the fabric of society that is in somehow enabling or allowing individuals to persecute this group of people?
That's another great question. And I think when we think of Brazil, much like the United States and many Western societies are patriarchies. And in Brazil, I would argue, and of course this is arguable and debatable, that we're seeing a hyper patriarchal, cis heteronormative foundation that is so insecure, frankly, in maintaining very rigidly defined gender roles of what is socially sanctioned or accepted for women and men in a very binary model, right? That has little tolerance. We're also talking about a society that is extremely machista, right? In the sense of, in many, many senses, so that the repression of gender difference is significant, even within oneself. So you have internalized homophobia, I think is such a part of a Brazilian narrative, whether it is and how it's culturally represented in media, through film, through literature, etc., in which many Brazilians who, similar to in this country when we talk about MSM, for example, or even WSM or WSW, women who have sex with women but don't consider themselves lesbian, men who have sex with men but would never self-identify as gay. In Brazil, and this is what we see around travesti life, conventional society holds that the person who is the active member of the sexual exchange, so to speak, is male. And the person who's receiving, the passive, this is a very Latin American, sort of very conventional notion, is feminized. So that often if, let's say, a Brazilian cisgendered male were seeking a sex worker, a travesti sex worker, would see himself, often requests to be penetrated, requests the travesti to become the active partner, but does not lose his status, if you will, as a heterosexually defined male. Even if he assumes the passive role, right, in that sexual exchange, because she appears and she self-genders as a woman. So these are really very complex issues that really drive home the fact that, much like in this country, trans women of color are the most victimized. Crimes occur, at the most alarming rates, to the point of extremely brutal murders, as we see constantly in this country. In Brazil, it may not be as public. It's, I think, becoming more public. There are no governmental sources that document these crimes. So it is up to the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, groups to document and to study the proportions of the crimes that are committed against sexual and gender minorities.
Do you feel in your work that society and government turns their back on those crimes and feels that they're not significant enough that they would punish them?
I think that's understating a little bit what I unfortunately really feel. And part of me, yes, I think that's part of it, but the reality is, and I in all my extra free time, which I don't have, I serve as an expert witness on asylum cases, particularly coming from transgender or travesti Brazilians, or gay or lesbian or bisexual identified Brazilians that are being persecuted and moving to either the US or Canada, or trying to, making an asylum plea. And I serve as an expert witness on those cases because it is so clear in my own research and in my daily experience that the police are, and those who are designated as the ones to serve and protect, are often the perpetrators of this violence, directly or indirectly, because of the corruption that exists within the police force and military police.
Either they're active participants or entirely complicit with those actions, and because of their view of somebody else's human condition, they feel that it's justifiable and based upon whatever moral view that they bring to it.
Yes.
It's really shocking, and it's of course one of the amazing things about the book, because of course you bring a lot of this out in the book, and I think it's very it's hugely fascinating, and I think the last thing I'll say about it is that it's sort of interesting where we started with pride, in the sense that the whole idea about what pride was about was that an oppressed group of individuals should have pride into who they are and not be victimized and not be shunned and shamed. And that's why it's called pride, that they should have pride. And here we have a situation where we have, for whatever reason, a country or a city or an area in which they may have the world's largest pride parade, but at the same time, they have a system which allows for some of the worst offenses for those who or the worst consequences for those who are trying to live their life in a prideful way on a day-to-day basis. And that's
impunity for those who commit those crimes.
Yes, which just propels the entire situation and enables the entire situation. And we touched on a little bit of the background and the history here, of course, the machismo and all of the things that go into making up a very complex society like this that you're talking about. And of course, with different political players as well too, but it is a wonderful paradox, and it's a terrible thing, of course, that's happening. But as far as paradoxes go, you see this, well, just as we described, you see the biggest pride parade and some of the worst crimes against those who want to be able to try it. We've come very close to the end here, and we haven't even looked at the presentation that you put together.
It's not a problem. I'm happy to leave it. Members in attendance can have wish to review it at their leisure.
Yeah, and maybe Paula, I don't know if you can. Paula, do you have a copy of the PowerPoint? Paula is still here. Can you share the PowerPoint with everybody so at least they can look through it, and maybe just throw it up in the chat? Probably just those who are here on the call will be able to see it, and we'll be happy to share it as well too. But it's been such a dense conversation, and there, of course, I'm not at all surprised when we're talking about a subset of a population with over $210 million or 210 million people. It's sort of astonishing, particularly with all these complexities here. Well, Stephen, we are unfortunately out of time, and I guess I just want to leave with some. As you thought about this conversation today, and you thought about the idea of what you wanted to get across with regard to this topic in the book, what was first and foremost on your mind?
Really, the reason that I wrote this book is that I was struggling with, one of the reasons, with the ethics of representation. As looking at a culture that is not my own, looking at categories of identities that are not necessarily among my own identities, and so writing the chapters around, particularly the two chapters about, the one about photography and SOS dignity and photographing trans travestis, really was at the center point of that. Who has the right to speak for whom, and on what basis, and with what intentions, and with which motivations. So working through those issues, and then looking at the balance, looking at the fact that so many of these individuals and communities that I'm writing about, and that's why I do the expert asylum cases, because it's my way of giving back in a concrete, real way of trying to help, so that I'm not, going in there to study these, subjects and then not return anything back, as a way to make a full circle. But really the issue is so many of these individuals have lost their lives and cannot speak for themselves, and have been, if not lost their lives, have been completely disinherited, rejected by their families, and have had either been silenced by death or AIDS, or other circumstances, that I think that there's a responsibility to get these stories out, these experiences out, especially when we're talking about a cultural imaginary that tends to carnivalize and spectacularize a space where everything is permitted, in the sense of carnaval, right? And the truth is quite contrary to that. So it felt like a need to tell the truth.
Yeah, and I just want to say, with regard to the book, I mean, as I go back and look at it, in the sense that you do a terrific job in trying to, in your own words, to translate what trans in Brazilian culture really means, which we have touched on here as well, and also about dealing with, oh yes, here's the, Paula has the PowerPoint up here, and also what it is that has happened with regard to honoring trans photography and artism in Brazil as well too. And I think that that's an important piece that we haven't even focused on, the art piece here, and some of these images. And what I was so impressed about in the book was the idea that you brought so many of these ideas out in the way of being able to understand artistic ways and literary ways and community ways, cultural ways, in which a community was being accepted by some other parts of the community, despite the fact that they were being subjected to so many other issues out there.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Hunter.
Yeah, no,
that was my goal.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. And you've just done a great job of it. I just want to take a minute or two more as we go through these slides to be able to get these images here. And of course, people are able to see, as we go through the various chapters here, how you dig in to the trans community in Brazil here. But as we said before, we knew there was a lot to discuss in this book. And so maybe we can come back for chapter 2.
I'm happy to come back anytime, and I'm honored to have been invited to talk about this book in the first place. It's definitely is a 10-year project. So,
is that right? Have you spent 10 years on this?
The seeds of the project were really a decade long. Yeah, and it's evolved in various ways throughout the course of that decade. Yeah, but it's a pleasure to meet with you and share what I've learned.
Stephen Butterman, thank you very much. It's great to have you. Again, the book is Queering the Paradise Paradox. And so you can get a copy of it from your local independent bookseller. And if you have to go to Amazon, I guess that's okay. But yes, you can get it from them. I want to do a shout out to my colleague, Paula Sierra, Paul,
Yay.
sorry that we went over 4 minutes. I know we try to keep these to 60 minutes every week. And Stephen, thank you very much for all your time, and give Alan a big kiss for all of us.
Will do. And thank you both so much for hosting me tonight.
Okay.
And Paula, thank you for sending these wonderful buttons from Stonewall for all my students in queer studies. They love them. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. See you all soon.
Good night. Thank you both.
Thank you.